Welcome everyone to What Makes It Tick. This day we are now, it's July. Can you believe it's July, guys? July 2nd. And we are going to talk today a little bit about remote productions and what is remote production as a whole is what we'll start off with. So I want to welcome my friends, Jonas coming in from Germany today, but I hear he's going to be in Paris for a month. So congrats to that, Jonas. Eric coming in from Connecticut, Guy coming all the way from Seattle in the cloud into because he's always in the clouds up there. And then Will Waters from long far away, Houston, Texas. And I see a couple more people that are just hanging out too. So welcome to you also for joining in. And we're going to talk a little bit today, like I said, on remote production. So from the get-go, we kind of need to define what is remote production. So I went to our trusty, ever so always the most accurate information you can find on the internet, the Wikipedia. That's sarcasm, folks. Interesting enough, it was a very interesting read whenever I read it. And I went ahead and I dropped it in so that everybody can just easily click on that link in the chat and you can get to the same information that I read. So from the top, starts out pretty good. Remote integration model, also known, this is what they're saying, is that remote production went to remote integration model. So also known as REMI, or at home production, a method of live production for television broadcasts specifically, and video distribution that transmits live feeds into a single centralized production facility or a workflow for integration into a finished feed. Seems pretty accurate, which is then distributed to broadcasters. So as a whole, I would say that's pretty accurate if you were thinking TV and REMI and that idea. Some history that I did find that I thought was interesting. That the first, or I'd say one of the first that I've ever heard of, NBC Sports, speaking of Olympics, in 1996, which was hosted in Atlanta, as many of us from here remember that specifically, to reduce the amount of staff on site and to maybe knock down some of those extra costs off. They went to a centralized production facility in Rockefeller Plaza in New York, and they dubbed it the Virtual International Broadcast Center, and then brought all that time shifted and taped footage up into them, and they basically did a remote production very similar, I guess, as many of us are doing nowadays in a different world, different time. 1996, that to me was like, wow, that's actually been a while. That's definitely been a minute. We've come a long way since then. Then as you kind of roll down a little bit further down, this one was a little bit more talking about lowering production costs as kind of as a main goal. And then of course we went into the COVID, and then boy, the drawbacks and criticism was harsh to say the least. You could tell there's been some people putting in comments that were definitely not a fan of the way REMIs are done, or the way remote production is done. So I didn't really want to focus on REMIs in that world. I really kind of wanted to talk about the bigger side of things. So back to today's, the most interesting thing is when I went into Wikipedia just for fun, I said, okay, what about cloud production? Zero, nothing, crickets. I thought I spelt it right, so I typed it in a second time. Just nothing there, which I thought was really interesting. But today we're going to talk about REMI, or remote production per se. So just call it remote productions. I didn't really want to call it REMI. So on today's topic, remote productions, I look at it as it's a combination of REMI and at home, and I think probably a big reason. Will, you might be able to back me up on this. Was the at home, did that come about because Fox didn't really want to call it REMI because that's what ESPN was calling it? You kind of have some inside info sometimes.
Oh man, this I'm trying to crack open a memory on that one. There was, yeah, I would say about 10, 12 years ago now, there's a bit of, what is this REMI? We were SVG. That's where the big debate was going on. Is it REMI? Is it at home? But it really comes down to just, it was which broadcaster had a competitive edge. So
Right.
we're going to define that and make it part of the IP. I don't think it fundamentally it's just at home, right? It's remote.
Yeah, exactly. And that was kind of my point too. It's like it's just remote production. What do you call it? Maybe we
Well,
call it at home.
I do think I see a relatively big difference in remote and at home production. Like Remy, we see a lot of bigger vendors, especially really just still doing centralized production, but all the sources are remote.
Correct.
Or the processing is remote. At home for me is all my operators are decentralized, maybe still controlling centralized equipment, but the operators are spread out. That's one of the big differences. And while a lot of companies are embracing Remy and building their remote production centers, distributed production, a lot of people still are like, I don't know, not sure yet.
That's why
That is the
wanted to
one
have
thing
this
that really
conversation.
went back
Yeah.
on during COVID. Like during
Yep.
COVID, everybody's like, oh yeah, stay at home. And now they're like, you like still fly into our production center?
Yep. And I thought that's exactly why I wanted to get into this today, was to kind of dig in deeper and try to figure out some of those things, the reason why. Now, I would also say there's another at-home version too. For the sports market here in the US, many times I've been hearing at home is being referenced to a facility or a university doing their production at home. And that meaning whether that's a Remy coming to them at home, or they may be at home doing their production, meaning their site, doing their production that way. So it's kind of like a couple of different ways. It's really just a point of view. For us, I had I guess I call it an epiphany many years ago. Whenever we were short and I had a contractor not show up, a subcontractor not show up for a show to run graphics. And I called back to my guys that were at the warehouse. We're across the country. This is the beginning of the days we were doing tennis and everything around the country. And I was like, hey, look, I need you to get on TeamViewer and I need you to listen to this audio I'm going to feed you. And I need you to run these graphics. And it worked, and it worked well. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to worry about trying to find somebody locally anymore, because one, I couldn't, but two, it was time out of my day that I didn't have to give because I was already switching a show and being in the middle of production. So for him, it was a little bit different. Of course, having to sit in his lazy boy and kick back and listen really intently on the headphones while his wife wouldn't leave him alone in the middle of the afternoon. But for him, it was a different experience. But for us, the scores changed. I was happy with that. And they were pretty much on time for all those times. Now, tennis doesn't move as fast as some sports. So it was probably one of the simplest ways of getting in. And that was our first step into remote production. But I see remote production as a whole, as Jonas already said, it could go a lot of different ways. It could be site to site or studio to event site, as many people refer to their setup. They're in their master control, like ours. I don't call it a studio. I call it a master control. It's just my way of throwing back to my TV days, I guess. But it's studio to site or master control to event site. So this one studio's location to cloud resources could also be looked at that way. So that's another way of looking at remote production. And then, as Jonas said, the distributed production, which I definitely subscribe to and have been doing it for years, is many operators. So many operator locations, so distributed production to the site. So you're controlling the resources on the site, but it also could be many operator locations to many sites, as we've done before too. And so we may be spreading responsibilities to different sites, bringing in people remotely, especially with these remote meetings and virtual meetings that many of us here are producing. And then the next step past that is not just to the site. It's like we're going to the cloud. So the content's coming from the site to the cloud. And then we have many operators spread around controlling those locations in the cloud. So is there anything else that I was missing in there? What other combination could there be?
I sometimes also try to differentiate between processing on site versus processing remote. because what I'm seeing is there's different models there as well. One where you take all the feeds and you do a backhaul back to the cloud or your production facilities or a centralized location. But then, especially in the lower end where you don't have enough bandwidth, we also see a lot of times remote control of the equipment that is on site, which that kind of also changes some of the like logistics requirement and like lower bandwidth requirements that you have versus like pulling back all those feeds. And it also solves that pesky, hey, we need to do IMAC problem, because you still have all your signals locally and you can output a mix locally.
Agreed completely. That's exactly what I've been running into also. And for us, I called it a hybrid RIMBY because we were doing more than just, as ESPN more or less said, this is the way we're doing RIMBY, is bring all the signals back to us, we'll put it into our PCRs and we'll mix it and we'll put it all together and make a final output. I personally was like, well, I didn't have the bandwidth when we were doing the beginnings of tennis stuff. I didn't have the bandwidth to book in at most of our events to be able to get that. So we were on a single, maybe 2 copper modems, and those were at that time 15 at most, maybe 20 megabits per second. That's not enough to get 8 channels of video up. There's just impossible out of that. Well, you could, but it wouldn't look good. That's for sure. So we were doing that reverse thing also, Jonas. So we were mixing with the equipment on the site and then sending out a single stream at that point. And the control was all coming down the download side. So there really wasn't any interrupt or any kind of problems and hiccups going over, because the upload was relatively untouched except for the broadcast out and a little bit of machine control just so we could see what was going on at that site too. So let's talk about the basics then. So what are the basics needed in thinking of this as an operator? So what are the basics needed in remote production operators? Anybody? Number one, what's the most important thing?
Bandwidth.
Okay. No, that would definitely be. All right. Number two.
An EIC.
An EIC that actually can understand it. All right. So I was thinking a little bit simpler of starting out. So bandwidth for sure, number one. Because if you don't have enough bandwidth, you're just out of luck. I was thinking comms is my first, because it seems to be that as we're talking and doing these remote integrations and things, it seems to be, boy, that's really looked over a lot.
That's Jeff, that's normal on any production. It's the first thing and it's the last thing out, and it's the thing no one thinks about, because it's either working or it's not.
It's working or it's not, and you don't know you're missing it until you're missing it, and then everything goes to hell in a handbasket at that point. All right, so after comms, so bandwidth, comms, what's next? To be multi-viewer of some sort, so you can see, right? You know what's going on. Now that multi-viewer could be a program monitor also. So it doesn't have to be a traditional multi-viewer. It could just be program. So that's all I sent back to Joey that was running the graphics at the beginning. That's all he got, he just saw a wide camera, and that was it. And so that was all he needed as a reference. After that, I kind of listed remote access. So qualified remote access to the machines or to remote computers, whether they are remotely on the site or in the cloud, either way. So I kind of see that as like the 3-4 basics of it. After that, I think we kind of get a little bit more deeper into it, is what would be the next steps. I have a feeling Jonas would say something like secured remote access, more secure remote access.
I mean, non-secured remote access isn't really remote access.
Okay.
I'll just invite everybody in.
True. Okay, I'm going to say Splashtop TeamViewer. They're technically secured.
Well, I would actually not put that in that list as one of the first ones. I would say control and remote desktop isn't nowadays on our productions. Remote desktop isn't on as top on the list as it used to be. We now have a lot of abstraction layers where like the minimum requirement, if like everything broke loose and like, I don't know, all you had was an iPad and a 10x5 network, you could probably do most of our shows a little slower, but we built the abstraction tools that you still could do everything. Splashtop and remote access solutions then come in as kind of the next step on the engineering. I think audio monitoring also is an important one, and
Good idea.
like some because especially like being able to listen into the room that is not live yet, that has been really valuable. Like at the start we had a lot of like program only outputs, so you just got program audio, but one of the issues then is like you're not there, you're not noticing them starting to close the doors, starting to be like, hey guys, everybody sit down.
I
You just
agree.
see your cameras, and if your camera ops are still I don't know, prepping or doing whatever, you might not get a notification on comms, hey, they're getting ready for us, and you might miss that, which sometimes we still have that issue, but we try to at least combat it with having a low latency view of the situation there. And then we have a higher latency actual camera feed. So for our commencements, for example, I see the fastest possible feed of what is happening on site. And then about a second later, I'm getting my high quality feed. So when they're starting to walk up to the podium, I know it's time to cut.
You know, it's funny how we've ended up at the same thing. You know, we're completely in different continents, and so we work together on shows at time, but the needs, and this is kind of what I wanted to talk about, is like the needs kind of are aligning of what we need, and that's exactly what we're doing between the Sage Studio. I have a WebRTC feed from it off of a single camera that's a spy camera. So it's an over the shoulder looking down. I could see, and the cool thing about it is I could see the entry. So whether or not the broadcast cameras, which they do take that one to air at times, but the broadcast cameras themselves aren't swinging over before they actually start walking out. So at that point, I could see them. They're okay. They're prepping. This person's about to come in, and we could respond to things or ask questions like, hey, I see somebody's coming in. Sharon's coming in. What microphone is she on again? Let's just double check that before she walks on the stage. Yeah. So no, I agree with you completely, Jonas. And it's funny how we ended up lining up on exactly the same thing.
I think if I had to choose the next one, it's probably documentation of on-site connections.
Oh God,
There's
yes.
nothing worse. Like I like to have lots of FOBs in my pipelines because sometimes that's an issue, but there's nothing worse than, not that that has ever happened, you get the switcher aux instead of the program aux, and suddenly as they start the PowerPoint or they start the entryway, you actually got the IMAX feed and they're fading the whole stream to black because they are fading the iMac to black while everybody walks in.
Yeah.
And you're like, what? Like, and they're like, no, it's all fine. I'm seeing it here on my multi-view. We still have program. So
right.
That, and then also knowing how your kit is set up if there is issues and you need to scramble and need to be like, okay, go this, pictures of your kit, like being able to say, actually, if you look on the left, there's a blue screw. If you turn that 3 degrees, it magically will all work again. And I found that is really important with remote production as well, like being able to say, hey, yeah, actually, I think you plugged it into the wrong SDI. If you look at it, it's one of those weird Blackmagic cards. Skip the first one, and then it's 2, 5, 6, 8.
Yeah. There is that too. Yeah. Documentation. No, I totally forgot about that too. But again, same experience. We're working with with a studio I helped build, but I still don't, somebody's got into it since then. 2 years later, there's been something moved from the as built drawings. And yeah, that was exactly the same thing. I'm like, what output are we on again? Because I was like, I'm not seeing what you're telling me I'm supposed to be seeing. So yeah, I agree with you. Current on-site documentation. I'll add the current to it. All right, so circling back a little bit more of the next step, or the next beyond the basics. So would you still say in that section would be secured access, though, more like VPNs, whether software or hardware? Or do
I think
you feel like it should start there? I'm just curious.
I think it depends on what you mentioned. We're talking from an operator perspective. Most of the time, I don't think operators need a network access. There's now so many tools that you don't need one-to-one network access, except for if you work with an ATEM, then you definitely do need that right now. If we were talking about engineering, probes and network access probably would have been my top two. But
Right.
operators nowadays, they don't really need network access. We have other means of securing it, be it behind Cloudflare Access or similar. And now I have a couple of clients who even don't use a VPN anymore. They just have a script with Cloudflare tunnels that brings all the TCP connections locally down. They need to log in with the same credentials that they use for all the other portal, and then they're in.
That
So
makes sense. Yeah,
for
that's
operators,
exactly what
not
I was
really.
thinking. So not necessarily a full VPN where they can see all the machines on that remote network or whatever, but more or less opening up access and giving them the limited access that they would actually need, not all the machines. No, I agree with you with that. It helps. It actually helps a lot. So you don't have to worry about something bad, or whether you're a bad actor or just an accident.
It's also a liability for the operators. Like
True.
I always teach that to my operators. It's like there's different kinds of operators, and some of them really want all the access. I'm like, look, if I give you access to this, you're now on the list of people who could go in there and mess it up. So I will ask you if you messed it up. And if you just looked at something and clicked something wrong, and that took the wrong route or something, that's really gonna be on you. Like there's certain things where I certainly think that it's the engineering's fault if there's a not well set up system for the operators and the set up to fail and not set up for success. But if you have all the access, and especially with nosy people, it really, really helps if they have limited access. And it, yeah, not that I think they would do anything bad, but now I don't need to worry about them and they don't need to worry about it from a
True.
liability standpoint.
That's a good point. That's definitely a different way of looking at it, and I agree with you completely. There was we have a mutual friend, and it made me cringe every time whenever I saw that the operators had control of the actual AWS infrastructure. That made me cringe every time. It was like nobody but me or my people, my direct operator, my direct engineers need to see that magic portal, because it just takes one click, like you said. And if you don't understand the difference between stop and terminate, it could hurt you. All right. So
Yep.
you were going to say something, Jonas. Go ahead.
So I think instead of secured access, I would say scoped access.
Ooh, nice word. I like that. All right. So if we're past all those things, I forgot to say something I would want on my next level of operators, the more experienced ones, would probably be router control, just so that they don't have to ask me to give them something on the multi-viewer. I would give them a small panel that would
That
say,
is still a
it's
really interesting one. Talking to a lot of people who work in TFC enabled trucks. Like what is really interesting, giving scoped router control. That doesn't really exist in the cloud yet, and a lot of people are talking about it. Like how do you allow a operator to get certain sources that they're allowed to get, and especially like there's kind of this whole evolution of cloud where like it starts with software-based switching, then it goes over to multi-tenancy or software-based cloud, and then multi-tenancy, which the multi-tenancy most people haven't worked out yet, but that's where scoped access will come in with router panels again, and that's something that PFC is really cool for, because you can be like, oh yeah, he has access to those groups and those outputs, and you can just route those.
It exists. It exists in the Sienna router. The Sienna NDI router, we could lock it down to a certain, they only access to this one panel, password protected to that one panel, and that one panel only does one function.
Yeah.
So there, but I agree with you completely. That is one of the things that is like, if you just gave them a say the simple free NDI router that comes with NDI tools, they could mess up your whole show that fast. It wouldn't take but 2 clicks, right? So past that, what about the hardware interface part? So hardware interface control of the remote computers and the software, of course, too. I guess that would that be at the beginning of the basics? I don't think so, because I'm thinking of the basics as like the announcer, the commentator, the producer. They don't need to touch anything, you know. So
most of the time it then goes on with 1 to 2 Stream Deck XLs, and then the next level would be an X Touch. And then after that, it gets more customized to what people need.
What they're familiar with and what
I don't
they
have
like.
Yeah, and also what they need. I don't have it close right now, but for example, for one show where we had full failover, I built out one of those red emergency stop buttons to actually trigger the failover between East and West Coast.
Yeah.
So I just had it open for me here, but there's some clients that might wanna, I don't know, I need to clear the last 10 seconds, or I need to take this offline right now, and then we would just send them a single button where they can smash it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I feel like that's kind of, I mean, that's I guess you call it the magic that we are all looking for. Is the easiest is you drop a piece of equipment down and it just ties in, and you don't have to worry about making a certain software work with a certain thing with a certain piece of hardware, that kind of thing. I had a couple other things, and like the last one would be I wish I could do this better remotely. So that's this section. What would I say I wish I could do better, or I wish this existed better to do remotely? Like right now, top of my list, color shading and painting cameras. That's still painful because it's hard to get back. Not tying the hardware has actually gotten easier. There'll be all the ROPs that we get from Panasonic. Those are all IP based, so
Yeah.
you could get it across if you need to. The there's others, there's Scorhoy, there's CNView that are more, I guess you'd call them multifaceted. They could go to multiple vendors and all, so those all exist. But the one thing that I have a hard time problem is like, and I think you and I we were watching the same thing last Sunday, a soccer match. I'm like, who's shading? Because it doesn't look good, guys. I'm looking at the final output and it's way off. And that's I think something that we actually can we're fighting now. Is like, where is a truly broadcast reference that we can see, or are we just looking at the final output and working from there?
I also see a lot of time there are great IP solutions, but there's kind of like, if you are beyond the SMT fiber where everything is built in, if you're below that, the interest of operators and the people on site to also run the second cable, like for Blackmagic, you would need to run the SDI return cable. For everything else, you probably should run an Ethernet cable. The interest in doing that, it's always down the line, and there always seems to come up something else before that gets done. So I think that's maybe like where someone with better looms would come in, where you could use fiber converters or something like that. But because, yeah, I agree, the software and the hardware stack actually kind of is there, but I don't see as many cameras getting connected to networking yet, that aren't PTSets. That
True. Yeah, that aren't it already either running off a PoE and they're connected anyway.
Yeah.
At that point. Yeah, I would agree. And that was one of the things that's like with my team, I was like, if it has a network connection on it, put it on the network. Just period. Well, what do we don't need it? Just put it there anyway, just in case we happen to need it. And it was easier. Our Z280, I think is the Sony Z280 camera, camcorder style, has a network connection. It's terrible. It's not an easy app to use, and it's really hard to get to it, but it does work. And every once in a while we would use it. Most of the time we just go out to the camera, but it was good to have it if we needed it. The Panasonic CX350, I had high hopes for it. Same form factor, camcorder type form factor. Super high hopes of it. It was terrible. Same thing. Terrible implementation of being able to control across a LAN. Were decent with their app on their phone or the iPad moving up to it, but I think that a lot of the manufacturers at that time, this has probably been 2 or 3 years now, those manufacturers they were like, oh yeah, it's got a network connection, but they weren't thinking like what we wanted as producers of remote control and a robust API that we could get to all the controls on it. Interesting conversation. I'll take a side conversation for a second. An interesting conversation I had earlier today is a gentleman based out of Norway that is working on it's currently an alpha, but he's moving pretty fast on it. That is looking really nice to be able to do remote shading, and it's a software GUI and everything. So we're going to be working with him some hands-on next week. Whenever I get back in the office, we're going to do some testing with his app and give him some feedback and access to our arsenal of cameras so that he can get more data points and such. But it actually looks like an RCP on the screen, which is finally short of, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Sony did it a couple of years ago. They came out with it, but I don't know anybody that uses it. Any of the trucks are always going to have their own hardware in place. For me, it was always something I wanted to do, or I'd love to have had. We use in our Panasonics the UB300 setting software for our UB300s because it was effectively a software-based CCU, and I didn't have to give up desk space that we had a limited amount of in our trucks. So I think that software-based or virtualized remote control and remote paint is probably something that could happen a little easier coming forward, not just being a VPN.
You see it with the Blackmagic cameras. All of them now having, well, not all of them, a lot of them now having Ethernet access and a really nice, robust API for that. I mean, that's just waiting for someone to build a nice remote controllable solution for that. And since it's HTTP, it's not annoying to remote it, right? You could use Cloudflare tunnels or just simple VPNs and don't need to worry about the UDP traffic all that much. You could even like put a small modem on it with a SIM that's VPN'd on the back end.
Yeah,
So
actually, we have one of the, speaking of modems and small modems, I have one of the CNView kits here.
Yeah.
And so I'm working with it right now and testing it to be able to use. And I was initially just looking at something that was a little bit easier to use for remote cameras themselves, technically. So that was the cellular, which could be cellular or it could be Wi-Fi. And so I just wanted to test what they had, and it's amazing. A great piece of kit. Costs a little money, but it's worth it if you get the tool set, right?
Did you get it with the LTE bridge?
No, I don't have it with LTE bridge. Currently, I'm waiting on that piece to come in. So
that's one of the really cool things. I was at NAB 2023. I walked up to the Cyan booth and was talking to them and talking about API and all that. And suddenly they're like, "Can you wait for like 2 minutes?" Walks off, calls their head developer in. And I always love it when you are at the right place when suddenly someone is like, "We don't show this to everyone, but come over here, open up the little desk that they have, pull out a laptop, and they're like, so here's our API server, and this is how you can do it. Because the cool thing with SignView is they actually allow you to also build GUIs on top, and they figured out their business model where you can just use their MQTT servers, and then you can publish and receive from that that way. So they have a really nice API that allows you to remote control it that way as soon as you have it online over the LTE. So it's a really neat solution.
Very, very. I've been following them for quite a while, and had a connection before COVID even with them, and I always wanted to look into it deeper, and we just kept missing each other. And every year I've been following them as they've been adding to it, and it's really come. It was so simple. I didn't set it up. I just handed it to Jarrett, which is my son, and he's a smart kid, but he's not as technical as I am. Once he got it in his hands, I was like, here, you just figure it out. And I was like, you call me when you need help. He never called me around the corner. So I walked in, he goes, yeah, I got to work with this camera and not working with that camera. But I think I've got it figured out. He rebooted it, guy came back into it. And it's like, it took him 15 minutes to set up. I couldn't even come close to that with a Scorehoi controller of teaching somebody how to add cameras in and everything. It was just super, super simple. So I know of a guy that is very involved with remote production. So I want to hear what would be on those lists that we're talking about. What is your, I wish I could do this part remotely? Where does it come down to you?
I mean, everything just becoming lower latency, I think is the biggest thing. Having sub-second pings, just when I took over those cameras for office hours during NAB, going through the VPN, there was a lag versus when I've tried other places direct. There's that finesse. If you feel any lag and you're used to operating on site, it's just latency. So that's the thing. When it matters, it matters. When it doesn't matter. But when it does matter, it's little things like that just
Yeah.
drive me completely bonkers because you think that move's going to do one thing and it does something else, and then you're like, oh man, did that go to air? So sometimes that latency's just it's the killer. That's the thing that I'd love to see is just tighter latency, and it's coming for everybody. It's just a matter of time before these rollouts occur as infrastructure just gets tighter and tighter.
But at a point, you can't beat physics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Light is light. Typical German answer. Yet.
Well, that's some of it too. I mean, controlling through Splashtop, controlling a machine in AWS, you got your hop, but sometimes that machine that's connected directly to the backbone, you're able to take advantage of that speed. So even though
So-
you're controlling something that's not on your site, it depends on how you're doing it too. Like I'll watch with central control, I'll watch the time code moving on the XTouch. And when I look up and see what it's going on in the multi-view, I'm like, holy camole, that's like, because it's MIDI, it's just text, it's just flowing through. It's so fast. I'm like, my goodness, like, okay, that's real, like that's
Yeah.
as tight as it's gonna get. I'm seeing like what's the process there for the multi-viewer, Jonas, on that VLC production where it's going what, Nimble,
Yeah,
Cloudflare Tunnel?
we do NDI to Nimble to web and then directly out, hitting managed sites, so we have secured access. And like the biggest problem that we saw at that office hours thing is certain vendor whose encoder we used told me it is, or told everybody, yeah, we support WIP, which is an open protocol, but somehow they only supported some vendors directly with WIP, which is really, really weird. So we had to use Dolby IO, which is great and scales well, but also has higher latency. And if you combine that with a hardware encoder, who especially for WebRTC right now still have higher latency, you get, like, I think we were at 300, 400 milliseconds of latency at NAB, but normally, yeah, that would not fly on most remote productions. And with software encoders, and Nimble is extremely quick between web, especially if you don't transcode. We found if you use something like Splashtop or Parsec and you open up Studio Monitor, most of the time we're faster with our WebRTC than the Studio Monitor. So like the NDI output out of vMix into Studio Monitor into the remote desktop tool, we're faster than that with WebRTC into your browser. So at that point, it really, like, we're low enough now that doesn't really matter a lot of the time. Where we see issues is if you go far outside of the continent where you reside in. Like, people always complain about latency, and I'm like, well, I'm just happy if the camera that I'm controlling is on the same continent. So like, it also takes a certain perspective shift and working certain shows to get accustomed to. Latency in general isn't a problem, but it's something that you need to be able to deal with. Like, the only time where latency really is an issue if you have a quick transmission window, or if you have really tight shots that you need to pull off live, like tracking, or if you do iMac. Like, those are the kind of three things where it really matters. Like for betting, where you only have like a 1 to 5 second transmission window where your whole production needs to happen. You can't spend 3 seconds of that on SRT latency and encoder latency. But if it's going to YouTube, nobody will, like, that's
not gonna matter. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in some
love
ways,
having
you
those.
could use that to your advantage. You can use latency. I know that in some shows where
Yeah.
you've known the cut was coming before the cut was coming, so you can make it for a better show because you're like, yeah, I know how long he's gonna hold on, so I'm not even gonna go to him. I'm just gonna he's just gonna give a 2-word reply.
We did double transport shows where we had the conversation happening on Zoom between the participants. So they have this really nice flowing low latency Zoom conversation. I had that on one screen, and then each of them had a hardware SRT encoder coming into our cloud as well, which I had on the other screen. So I saw, okay, they're gonna pick up their cup and start drinking in 2, 3, there they go. And you could cut away from it. Which also is really interesting with automation if you hook that up to like auto switchers, and you have, like, we just used a delay for our use case because you can produce a live edit that doesn't look like it's live anymore and just really looks really polished, because suddenly you can do L cuts. Like, normally live does L cuts, but you can also do a J cut where you cut to the two-up of who is going to start talking just before they start talking.
True.
Because the automation will trigger it before the video signal actually hits. So yeah, latency is an opportunity to engineer and to build around, but a lot of people still are scared about latency. Like, that's probably the biggest. But how is the latency? Which often is a problem, like in conversation it is, but for us on the production side, it isn't too much of a problem.
Yeah, I love having conversations with people that have been in broadcast for a long time, and they're like, but I don't know, the cloud is just, you have so much latency if you're using the cloud.
And then they use a live view for a 2-up conversation and have it tuned at like 5, like,
yeah,
we call it the naughties, where you just do
the non-small.
Thank you for that. Yeah, it's a really pleasure to be here, and I'm here at XY. Like,
that's not a conversation.
It's
a pitch. Yeah, it's a pitch.
Yeah, and the same way you have to manage it with that, you also have to manage it with your production.
Yeah. I was really impressed in a couple of these world feeds that we've done back, because of I was watching the actual output, and I was like, man, how in the world did he get that close? Because he was tight when they were going to break and stuff. They were really spot on, and I was like, I know we're not, but it was just a matter of the construction that the producer had us doing, so that it allowed them to cut out at a certain time, because it just made sense. It wasn't something that we were planning on going to break at that point, because we didn't have to worry about it. But they were cutting around us really well, and I was like, that's a talent. but also they're also doing this, like you said, a slip slide. So they're watching what's coming in. They already know what's happening, but they're cutting 10 seconds, 15 seconds later, because linear TV, what time is irrelevant there too, most of the time, for especially for long broadcasts and things like that. But I would agree with you on using the YouTube latency as your friend at times. Sometimes it is your friend, but most of the time it's not. Yeah, but sometimes it is. But I love
One
when they
of
ask that
the-
question. It's like, what, look, YouTube latency is so long. I was like, are they there? It doesn't matter. It's like they're
Also,
across
it
the
really
world.
isn't. Like right now in Europe, there's the European football happening, and a lot of people. It's really interesting right now. There's a lot of discussion about where do you need to watch so you don't hear the rest of the people scream before you see the goal.
Think about that. That's true.
Which
Because the different providers
obviously-
are different timing. Ah,
Yep. And like in the past, if you had, for example, telecom, you actually had an issue because they did the digital, they took it off the set, did all their digital stuff that they needed to do and put it then on the line. And like cable was even later after that. So they actually are working this year on what they call, I think, goal boost, where they boost the latency to get you closer. But like today, I was watching a game and I suddenly hear, like, I see a goal. I'm like, oh, looks like no one is watching. And 30 seconds later, my neighbors are freaking out because their team just scored a goal. So latency still is a thing.
Yeah.
It's
and it definitely, because I fed a many hour of content to the betting side, that which we don't have, so much of us here in the US don't have any kind of real reference of how big betting is or gaming is overseas. It's huge, huge. And it made me cringe at times because we're so used to this as a two-way conversation, how fast it is. They're like, yeah, we're really working on getting our latency down. It's like, wait, yeah, I'm watching the repeat back and it's like 10 seconds. It's like, that's low. And I was like, he goes, yeah, that's the best we've been able to get it in years. I was like, wow. It's because that's the delivery formats. They just didn't have options. And with things like WebRTC coming to fruition and Dolby is definitely, that is like 100% their focal length right now, is fast distribution, really fast, low latency distribution to be able to get to those betting partners is huge. Be a
Yeah.
big thing. So if we had, all right, so we went through if I wish we could do this better remotely. We didn't get the only other thing I kind of put it on the one before this, but that I had in my list was automatic hardware controller enrollment. That's just, man, that to me is like the holy grail. Being able to say, hey, just plug in the device, much like hopefully we'll be able to make happen with Joe's central control core to core type setups, and just have it just do its thing without us having to dive into it and work through all the magic hoops and stuff.
That's one of the cool things with PAP links. Like I really like the onboarding where I can have my distributors send a PAP link on site and send me the serial number before they ship it out. And when it arrives on site, it all just works. Like I know
Because
Alex,
you pre-program it. You
Yeah. you can with PAP link, you can add it by serial number. And I know Alex at NAB had that experience where he was like, yeah, the first day is going to be us setting up the network. He got it, but he got in his auto confirmation, got the serial number and gave it to me beforehand. So when it arrived at his hand and he plugged it in and he was like, well, what do I need to do now? I'm like, you already did everything you need to do. Now it's my job.
Yeah,
I'll take
so
it from here.
But did you actually have it provisioned where, like your SpeedFusion provisioned, all those pieces done, any kind of ports opened up and closed down, or was it just so much that it was enrolled at that point?
Great. It was enrolled, but the group in this case we didn't do it because it was a new in control. But if you do it on the group level, you could have everything provisioned already.
All right, yeah, and then you're just, or what do they call it, drop-in mode or something like that? Is that same thing?
Drop-in mode that's a really cool mode, but it's not that. Drop-in mode allows you to be like, you know what, whatever you're doing with your router doesn't seem to work. and you just drop in between an existing router and the rest of the infrastructure, and it just bridges the connection, and then you can start doing other stuff on top of that. That's what drop-in mode does.
Okay. I was always wondering about that. I'm just
It's
thinking drop in.
really
It's like,
cool though.
Which peplink was that, Jonas?
That was the B1. The B1.
balance one,
Just the B1.
balance one.
Yeah, balance B1.
Yeah.
The new one that is
Yeah.
like $300. They now released the 5G and the Plus model, which is the
Mhm.
4G model. But what you could also do is get the B1 and then get the B2 Micro that they just released, which has a Speed Fusion engine in it and also has 2 LTE providers.
Mhm.
So at that point, for a home setup or a single venue setup, the B1 has 2 Ethernet WAN ports. You can use one of them for the micro. You enable a Synergy controller, which makes them kind of B1. B1 B1 control plane, where it allows you to control the WAN of the other one. And then you can also plug your venue in, and then everything just works. And if everything falls down and you just need to load up your phone SIM with a lot of data and plug it into the front, that's what I love about mine. Like I have right now, I'm on it, and I have fiber from one provider and cable from the other provider. And if both of those go down, I'll pull out my phone, plug it into the front of it, and it starts tethering and everything works like normal. So yeah, that is a great piece for remote production, because then they have in control. So if you have any web interfaces, you can, without needing a hardware VPN, you can just reach into it. So while I'm gone, I have it set up that my switch, my power distribution box, everything that has a web interface is set up in control. So remotely, I can reconfigure my switch and all that without even needing to be on the hardware VPN.
Yeah, I found it super helpful. Yeah, super helpful to have. And as Jonas says, he's going to be leaving. When are you leaving, Jonas? You're going to be playing with the Olympics. I'm proud of you. Soon. Is that tomorrow? Soon?
Next week.
Oh, so next week. All right. Well, we are going to have a show next week. I'll be back in the office then. I'm going to take a real short trip out myself to go play with the Cowboys in Nashville for a little while, and then be back for next week. But I was hoping I'd catch you before you left. So I have another project we're working on. I'll let you know about that later. All right. So here's the big question to ponder for everybody. And I get this question a lot because we were sending out quotes left and right. We're doing really well with getting inquiries coming in. Got a few times though that whenever it comes to remote productions and cloud productions, it's just remote operations in general. The first question is the operators is like, how does that work? And I think Jonas, you've experienced a little bit of the same. Is distributed workflow? Are you sure that works? Like, yeah, I know it. I personally have been doing it for years. I know it works. That's probably my first question that we have to kind of overcome, or the first hurdle we have to overcome. The next one, this is the hard one. Well, shouldn't remote productions be substantially cheaper than an on-prem production? What are your thoughts on that?
It depends on how you measure success, value, and cost. You get way better, in my experience, you get better operators, cheaper, and more sustainable with remote production than on-site production. You don't have to pay per diem. You don't have to pay a hotel. You don't have to pay travel. You have to probably pay some shipping for equipment and probably for 1 to 2 people on site still as engineers. We rarely do things where like it's completely no one is on site. Clever hands, at least 2 clever hands are always good to have there in the camera, like someone to set up the cameras and all that. It most of the time is still a fair bit cheaper. It depends on what model you do also. The extent where I think that comes in with shouldn't it be cheaper is smaller events that don't take advantage of everything remote production can offer. Like it's one of the issues we often run into with smaller events is they say oh, that's pretty expensive. I'm like, yeah, because this is the lowest tier that we'll offer you because we have productized our tiers. Here's all the things you also get for free in this tier that you're not using. So yes, cloud production or remote production often isn't that much cheaper. You get a way better show with less, like in my experience, our operators are great, but they work so much nicer and are so much happier and a happy operator and like everything fits
agree
together
with you
so much
there.
smoother if they slept in their own bed, saw their sons and daughters before they went to school, can
Yep.
have lunch with them, and then come back. Like
Yep.
tech and all that is great,
Big difference.
but my personal favorite is every time I hear a young father or old father or whatever, a parent being home and being like, you know what was great? During my 1 hour break that we had, I got to play outside with my son. I got to like help my daughter with her homework.
Quality of life. Quality of life.
Quality
hands
of
down.
life is so much better. And we are in the market right now where experienced operators is a shortage. And a lot of people are like, you know what? Yeah, sure, I'll do your thing. Ship me your control interface, and as long as I can stay home, that sounds great. Oh, I have to like be there early. Yeah, I'll roll out of bed 2 hours early. I have to say like, yeah, that's fine because my commute doesn't suck so much.
Yeah, there is that too. And for those of us that are around the big cities, that alone could be a soul sucker. Just
It
getting out
also
of the commute.
It also opens up if you do remote production where the processing is not on site. It opens up a lot of possibilities for additional distribution. So now
Sure.
that you have all of those, sure, you want to add ISO recording? Sure. You want to have a VIP experience where we pipe the 4 camera feeds or 10 camera feeds that you choose into a Zoom meeting where people can see all the behind the scenes and generate you some additional revenue? Sure, no problem. We can do that.
It's easier to do that than having to roll out another truck. As
Additional
Greg was saying
bandwidth.
last week, he was like, yeah, they have a truck for pre-show. Now their pre-show at PGA is literally 3 semis, the pre-show. And then the show is 5 semis. And then the post-show is another 3 semis. So it's not as a small thing just to add in an extra 30-minute show. And I agree with you completely about the quality of life being, to me, that's where we all ended up in my infrastructure and my way of doing things in the tennis world was all about being able to give my employees, I kept them around longer because they had a higher quality of life. Now,
and that ends up producing a better quality show.
consistency,
Like with
consistency
consistent repeating
Mhm.
shows, the hardest thing is to have a consistent great show. Consistent good okay show, that's easy. Like yeah, sure, you can probably bring people in 5 hours early, have them trained or something, but if you want a really great consistent show, not needing the people to travel there really helps.
Yeah.
And they want to stay, like sustainability is the big thing. Like yes, we also save some parts of CO2 and all that with it. That's one part of the sustainability, but also the sustainability of your people not burning out.
Sure.
Is, I mean, for me,
Sure.
my freelancers are more likely to work with me if it doesn't suck to work for me. And most people don't pay like good enough hotels, or
Yeah.
there aren't
Sure.
even good enough hotels. Like that family time, that's worth so much to them. Like that's a great benefit. Let's talk about like stop giving them free fruits at the venue. Like an hour with their kid, that's worth a whole lot more than
Very
being
true.
home.
No, I agree with that. Or their dog I saw a guy was getting some love there. Nice little
Yeah, I had to grab the
slobber.
dog. I could just whistle and he'll come on over. And that's a nice comfort thing, like if I'm sitting here and we got 15, I'm like, call the dog over. It's like, all right, comfort dog, hey, how's it
Yeah.
going? Get him some food, let him go potty, whatever. When I'm on the road, I gotta get somebody coming over. They're hanging out. It's like Oh man. And so there's so much more planning that has to go in. Who's going to take care of the yard? Or I come home and my grass is this tall, it's like, so there's all kinds of stuff
True.
that you could just take care of when you're being able to work from a
Well, you're
farm.
close by. Yeah. Yeah. All benefits on all great benefits for sure. But guys, this has been a great conversation. I have to do have a heart out that I've got to get out because I've got to go pack still. I haven't actually had a chance to do that yet. So leave it out tonight, and we'll definitely be back again next week. I have a vendor that I hope that we'll be able to bring on. I'll make an announcement on the Discord though. But I can't prelude that just yet. But I do have a vendor that I'm talking to, and we hope the schedules can line up, and things could be pretty cool. So I want to thank you all for coming out, and that's another episode of What Makes It Tick. Thanks for sharing, everybody. Jonas, safe travels to you going to Paris. Enjoy. Say hi to Tucker for me, and Mickey and all the rest of the crews that end up out there. And God, thanks for showing up. Eric, thanks for hanging out. Always great. And we'll see you again, guys, next week.